Hello everybody, welcome back to, once again, my item sets. This time we're looking at Kayle. I guess before I start talking about the different builds that I use, I guess I should say that all of this has been tested in Diamond in Ranked by me, and it all works beautifully. So there's none of this stuff that isn't viable. Even though some of it might look a little weird, all of these builds are extremely effective, and they all serve sort of their own purposes. Up here, we have the usual stuff for my item sets, which is just consumables and smaller items. Foresight Alteration, I don't always use this. It's better late game for checking Barons and Dragons, but most of the time, I don't even buy this or get this thing. I just keep the normal wards, but it's up to you. Pink Ward is obvious. This is on all of my item sets because you have to have that on all champions. The way you start out at level 1 on Kayle is always get Doran's Ring in 2 pots. It's just the best. It gives you the best all-in potential, and at the same time, it gives you a lot of sustain because of the mana you get out of Doran's Ring. There's really no alternative here. If you went Cloth and 4 pots, you wouldn't be able to win your lane because you won't be dealing any damage. And if you run, If you run a Corrupting Potion, your all-in potential is going to be garbage. If you're playing against a melee champion that can actually efficiently gap close on you, and you don't have the flat HP from Doran's Ring, you're gonna get shit on with Corruption Potion. So if you're playing against, like Irelia, or if you're playing against a Cho'Gath and he Qs you and he gets close to you, without Doran's Ring, you're fucked. So it is the smartest starting item on Kayle in my personal opinion. As for boots, I always run Berserker Greaves, and I almost always rush them, just because the extra mobility is extremely good for just surviving against ganks, but also for chasing your lane opponent down when you're trying to kill them. The way Kayle gets kills in lane most of the time is just that your lane opponent doesn't expect that your sustained damage is so high, and it's not really burst damage that nets you kills. So having movement speed for chasing people down and having attack speed for sustained damage is key. Sometimes I get refillable, it just depends. And finally, we have Elixir of Sorcery because I don't build crit Kayle, so I don't use the red one. If you build crit Kayle, this is not the guide for you. This is magic damage primarily. And of course, Sorcery is the best for that. It also gives you better heals, so there's that. As far as my builds go, there are 3 different things that I do on Kayle, generally speaking. I guess I should talk about the commonalities first before I dive into the individual builds. First of all, if you're building magic damage or just any kind of AP Kayle, Nashor's Tooth automatically is just a staple. You can't really not get Nashor's Tooth as your first item, at least after your boots if you get them first. Nashor's Tooth has to be your first main item. Obviously, if you're going AD Kayle, you do have options like Essence Reaver or maybe Trinity Force, but then again, that's not really what this video is about. On another note, I should mention that Ginsu's Rageblade, as you can see in my item builds right here, I always get it as a 3rd item. I never get it as a 2nd item. You can get it as a 2nd item, though. It's not a bad thing to do that. It's just not something that I do personally, because I feel like there are other items that are more necessary than Ginsu's at that time in the game. Also, another thing is, sometimes when you see Kayle players get Ginsu's as their 2nd item, they think that because they have Ginsu's now, they're like gods, and they play overly aggressively and they do these stupid mistakes because now they think they can kill everything. The fact of the matter is, even if you build Ginsu's as your 2nd item, you're not going to be murdering everything just yet. The way Kayle scales, in my experience, is your 2-item power spike is nice, but your 3-item power spike is where you become broken. So to me, it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense to get the Rageblade immediately. It's better to get something else first, and then you buy the DPS item, the Rageblade, for your third item power spike, and your power just goes through the roof. Unless, of course, you're getting Nashor's Blade of the Ruin King, in which case your scaling is a little bit different, at least against tanks it is, because Nashor's and Blade as a 2-item combination just works wonders against tanks. But that's a kind of a different story. So I think first of all I'll talk about my favorite build out of all of these 3 builds, which is the Rylai's build. So the general philosophy behind this build is that you combine Rylai's with Runaan's Hurricane because the Runaan's bolts proc the slow, and your AoE damage from your Righteous Fury auto attacks also proc the slow. Now, the reason why I like to get Rylai's immediately after Gnasher's Tooth is because I want to make the most use of the health. If you're getting a health item on a squishy champion in League of Legends, generally speaking, it's not very good to get that item in the late game, because extra health in the late game is just not as efficient of a stat, and on top of that, it's just not as impactful. The fact of the matter is that most of the times in the late game, you're either going to get blown up or you're not, and 400 health is not really going to make as big a difference. At least not as big a difference as it is in the early and in the mid game. So you can argue until the end of time between whether you should really value the health that much, but obviously it's not the real reason we buy the Rylai's. There's also 100 AP, which is pretty nice, but then there's the slow, which is just broken stupid good on Kayle. If you've actually tried playing Rylai's Kayle, you know what I'm talking about. Nobody can kite you, you can chase everyone down, and you can also kite very well for yourself. So Rylai's is just amazing on Kayle. After Rylai's, we get the Ginsu's because we need the DPS. If you get Ginsu's Rageblade any later than your third item, I would say that's a mistake, because your DPS will be terrible. Having a Rageblade as your third item is kind of a must in my book. Then we get the Runons because it gives us ridiculous teamfight potential. It gives us the most AoE damage out of any item in the game, and on top of that, the utility with your Rylai's, which was already retarded, is now just through the roof with Runons because of the bolts proccing on hit effects and all that. And then finally, we just get the Wits End just for DPS purposes, because the item just interacts with Rageblade so well. So that's the idea behind that build. The situations in which I'll use this build is basically any situation where I don't feel like I need to burst people down instantly, or in a situation where the enemy team doesn't really have a huge tank. If I want to deal with a lot of burst damage, I'll go with the build at the bottom here, which is the full AP build, which is the one build that uses my 10% CDR rune page. These two builds both use my 20% CDR rune page. And if the enemy team has huge tanks, then I'll go with the tank killer build, which is the one in the middle. Speaking of the tank killer build, this build, if you're playing against an Aurelian Soul, or a Brand, or just a tanky target in general, basically anything that builds HP, this build is perfect against that. You don't have to use this build only if you're against somebody in lane who is relatively tanky. You can also just do this build if you don't want to deal with a 4k HP Volibear Cinderhulk jungle, for example. So that it's a very diverse build. You can kind of use it whenever you want, but it is dedicated to killing tanks. So basically, the reason why we get the Blade of the Ring King early is because, since this build is dedicated to killing tanks, well, we want to get that Blade of the Ring King as fast as we can to kill that Maokai, or whatever tanky target is in our way. After that, we get the Ginsu's Rageblade as a third item. For the same reasons I've mentioned before, you just need the DPS. Wits End also for DPS purposes, and it even shreds a little bit of Magic Resist, which goes along well with your passive. And then, of course, we finish off with the Void Staff, which just melts, or makes you melt tanks. I mean, you already kind of did, but, well, Void Staff is just like icing on the cake. The major downside I have to mention about this build is that there is very little defense. The other two builds have the advantages that with the Rylai's build, you get 400 HP relatively early in the game, which is very, very nice. And with the full AP build, you're going to be stacking so much ability power that your heals, the heals from your W, are going to be ridiculous. So that's the way that build sort of, quote-unquote, defends itself. This build, which is just a full single-target tank shredder, it has barely any defense. It has 10% lifesteal from Blade, and the rest is pretty much just Kayle's sort of inbuilt own defense. And if that's not enough, you're going to want to go with one of the other two builds, because this is very aggressive, very single-target heavy damage. Admittedly, the AP build is also single-target damage, mainly, but it's more of like a burst type of damage. It's not as much sustained damage as this build. The Blade of the Ring King is the highest single-target sustained damage out of all of these. Obviously, the Runaan's Hurricane with Rylai's is the most AoE damage, and this one down here is kind of a bit of both, but it's better for killing squishies. So, finally, talking about the last build, is just, this is the build you see the most often in, like, super high elo master challenger tier Kayle one-trick pony kind of players. Basically, the philosophy behind this build is you get as much damage and utility out of Kayle as possible by just stacking the crap out of ability power. This allows for you to have ridiculous heals, and at the same time, you'll have a lot more burst damage. You'll have a lot more upfront damage than the other two builds. As far as the build order goes, there's a whole bunch of different stuff you can do. You don't have to do what I have displayed here, which is my personal favorite way of doing this build. You don't have to go Rabadons into Ginsus. The reason I like it is because it goes along very well with the philosophy of having huge heals. Rabadons gives you the best heals out of any of these items. It also gives you the most burst damage possible. You might think that Lichbane gives you the most damage, burst damage, but it actually doesn't, not in comparison to Rabadon's Death Cap. You can go Lichbane, though. If you want to do that build order, it would probably look something like this. So you'd go Lichbane into Ginsus. This is something you can do if you feel like you need the cooldown reduction and maybe the move speed from Lichbane. It's possible. You could also go Ginsu's Rageblade as your second item. Like I've mentioned before, that's viable. It's not something I do, but it's possible you can do that if you want to. And if you want to kill tanks, you can have the Void Staff right after your Ginsus. Personally, I never ever do this, because if I want to kill tanks, I just use the Blade of the Ruin King build, because it just does the same job but better. So there's no real reason for me to do this, but if you hate the Blade of the Ruin King build for whatever reason, then this is a good way to kill tanks, basically, is what I'm saying. So, essentially, the short story about this build is the build order. You can do whatever you want, as long as you're being smart about it. I think that about sums it up for the three, in my book, the three most powerful ways to build your items on Kayle. So thanks for watching, everybody. I hope you learned something useful, and peace. Have a nice day.